And welcome to the Games Monster Podcast, the video game podcast from Extreme Improv. So if you haven't done so already, head over to youtube.com/Extreme Improv and smash that subscribe. Or if you're listening to the audio version of this, whichever platform you're on, Apple, Spotify, Google, it's all good. Click that subscribe and help support the show. With this, today we are going to be getting into the Nintendo Switch Pro. Yes, we're going to be talking and speculating. This isn't me reporting that there is confirmed to be a Nintendo Switch Pro. It'll be a little bit of speculation at the likeliness and expectations, the ups, the potential downs of a Nintendo Switch Pro, and whether or not I think it's going to happen. There's lots of stuff on the news at the moment. If you check out the video game news, where it's saying that people are saying, once again, there is going to be a Nintendo Switch Pro, and it's going to come this year. We have been hearing about the Nintendo Switch Pro since before the Nintendo Switch released in 2017. Here we are 4 years later. Every single year it's like, okay, this year is the year. We're going to get the Nintendo Switch Pro, and it hasn't happened yet. There's loads of things to look at with this. I don't think that it's necessary that there's been anything come out. I'm just having a look here. If I go to like big sites like IGN, Nintendo Life, stuff like that, they're reporting stuff where it says about the Wall Street Journal reported blah 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 blah, and like this still, it just hasn't happened yet. We have not had the Nintendo Switch Pro. Now, obviously, there is now the PlayStation 5. There is the Xbox One Series X and Series S. And the big thing for whether or not there may be a Nintendo Switch Pro is just the idea that, is the Nintendo Switch just going to be left behind in terms of power and not be able to keep up and have games that come out on both the PS5 and Xbox Series X and the Switch? Now, we can look to the history books for a lot of evidence of where current thinking may come from that will either suggest that there will be a Nintendo Switch Pro or that suggests that there will not be. Is it likely that we're just going to get the next Nintendo machine? Now, let's look at the first way of looking at this. Let's look at what we've had happen in the past with the power gap. So, obviously, we had the Nintendo Wii. The Nintendo Wii came out and was basically a slightly more powerful Nintendo GameCube. The fact that it was as powerful as the GameCube, which was the same era as the PS2 and the original Xbox, and the fact that the PS2 sold 150 plus million, I think 155 million consoles around the world, meant that if you then have the Nintendo Wii, which by the time it was all said and done, I think sold 101 million machines, you can see why people would be like, well, we've already got 150 million PS2s out there. If we now make a game for the new machine, the Wii, we can also put it on the PS2. Also, with putting a game on the Wii and the PS2 was a cheaper machine. It was cheaper and easier to develop for than developing a game for the PS3. So there was just a win-win situation all round for why they could make a game on a modern machine, the Wii, and still put it out on an older machine, which in itself would justify, well, okay, we don't need to necessarily worry about making a game just for the Wii when the PS3 and the Xbox 360 are out, because this game just for the Wii is also going to be on the PS2, which has got 150 million consoles out there. It made total sense. By the PS2 existing, it meant that putting stuff on the Wii made a load of sense. Or even if it was a case of putting stuff on the Wii, it made sense where we can still put stuff on the PS2. The power gap there between the Wii and the 360 and the PS3 didn't matter, because between the Wii and the PS2 there was like 250 million consoles to potentially sell. There's 250 million customers with those machines potentially. Now obviously there will be crossover, but there was such a huge install base that it was like, it's worth putting it on the older machine, on the PS2, and it's worth making it for the Wii because of the PS2, and because, let's not forget, the PSP, PlayStation Portable. Things were coming out for the PSP, and they were also on the PS2. I remember, like, there was Silent Hill Origins, and it's like, oh, I want that for the PSP. Oh, it's cheaper on the PS2, and I can play it on my TV. Oh, yeah, my PSP may be the new thing that I've got here, but I think I'll just play it on the PS2. And then later on, sticking with the Silent Hill theme, is that they could get Silent Hill Shattered Memories and think, well, okay, we'll also put it on the PS2. And I think I'm correct in saying that that happened. But I can't remember, to be honest, if it came out on the PSP. My thought in my head is that it perhaps came out on all three. But if I'm wrong, I apologise. But because there was 3 different machines that were all similar in power, they could put it out on all 3. Now, the GameCube and Wii didn't really have games come out on both because the Wii replaced the GameCube, and the GameCube itself hadn't sold super well. The Xbox had already had its replacement come out a year before the Wii, so it didn't make sense to keep putting stuff out on the original Xbox. But because Sony have always supported their consoles, and even though we're talking about the PS2 to PS3 transition, they supported the PS1 for years after the PS2 came out. They supported the PlayStation 2 for years after the PS3 came out. And with backwards compatibility, even though it all kind of started to go wrong with the PS3, was included. So it meant that people who were making games for the PS2 didn't have to worry about, oh, well, people have bought PS3s now. They could still play the PS2 games absolutely fine. So it made complete sense to make a game for the Nintendo Wii, because it would also be backed up by the same game being just as compatible to put on the PSP and the PS2. Now, within a few years, the PS2 did start to wane as the PS3 found its footing more, and the Xbox 360 found its footing more, and people started to forget about the PS2. And what you'd find then is that, and I'll give the example of Dead Rising. Dead Rising came out on the Xbox 360, but because the Wii was selling so well, they actually made their own version, same storyline, completely different engine, completely different mechanics, of Dead Rising, chop till you drop, retelling the same story as Dead Rising on the Xbox 360. And there's some examples like that. Some Call of Duty games came out on the Wii and also came out on the PS3 and 360. And basically it meant that a different company, like a different team, had to develop the same game, different story, so that it would take advantage as best they can of the Wii, which usually meant something to do with motion controls, but also so that it would work and run on the Wii, but obviously wouldn't be the same in-game assets that you'd get on the PS3 and Xbox 360. The Wii, compared to the Xbox 360 and PS3, meant that the same game could rarely come out exactly the same on both. When we look at the Nintendo Switch, and look where its place is alongside the PS4 and the Xbox Series X, the Xbox One, it's not been easy to guarantee that games that could come out on both. We have had it. The first big example was Doom 2016. Wasn't even announced until a few months after the Wii came out. Not the Wii, the Switch came out. Would be coming to the Switch, and it would be the same game that came out on the PS4 and the Xbox One. And people were like, how is this magic, this sorcery happening? But it did happen, and whilst there were obviously ways in which it wasn't as good, it was the same game. It perhaps had got downgraded graphics, downgraded lighting, but the assets were still essentially the same. The level design was the same, the gameplay was the same. Mortal Kombat is another example like this. Excuse me. Like with Mortal Kombat 10 or Mortal Kombat 11, they did come out on both. But these examples are basically few and far between, but it was possible. And what's interesting is just how the Wii was a slightly more powerful GameCube. The Nintendo Switch itself is basically a slightly more powerful Nintendo Wii U. Hence why we get all of these ports across from the Wii U to the Switch. Hence why Zelda Breath of the Wild came out for both the Wii U and the Switch like at about the same time, maybe the exact same day. I think that's correct. I don't think they delayed the Wii U edition. Maybe they did though. So, if the Nintendo Switch is basically the Wii U again. We could look and say, well, could Doom 2016 come out on the Wii U? And it didn't. And loads of things that came out for the PS3 and 360 may have been possible on the Wii U, but people saying, well, it's always slightly worse on the Wii U. The Wii U, frankly, even though it's the generation after the PS3, isn't as strong as the PS3. And that was a huge error by Nintendo. So then when they made the Nintendo Switch, and it was basically the Wii U again, it's like, well, hang on. This is the PS3 era equivalent in the Wii U, now followed up, not just in the PS4 era, which is when the Wii U came out, but now it's coming out, even though there's about 3 years between them, as the next generation after the Wii U, which technically means that the Nintendo Switch is a PS5 rival, which came out basically with PS3 era capabilities. Now, lots of people will hear that and say, that isn't quite fair, that isn't strictly true, there's so many this or that, which means that that isn't the case. But when you think that, just talking in terms of power, the Wii U, which came out as a rival to the Xbox One and PS4, was only as powerful as a PS3, and then the Switch is a slight upgrade on the Wii U, it means that the Switch has got PS3 and Xbox 360 era graphics as its comfortable zone. To try and get Doom 2016 and Mortal Kombat 11 out of the Switch is described as wizardry, and yet it comes out during the same launch window, the same time period. Doom Eternal is an example of something that came out significantly later on the Switch because they couldn't get it done and to be ready, because the wizardry took longer to bake, so that they couldn't get it done at the exact same time as it came out on those other machines. So now what happens when the PS5 is out? The PS5 is out 3 years, so late 2020, so it's approaching 4 years, but late 2020 the PS5 and Xbox Series X came out, compared to the Nintendo Switch coming out in March 2017. And does this mean that Nintendo are just going to have to release the Switch Pro, or the Super Switch, the next Switch, the Switch 2, whatever they want to call it, within the next year or so? And then it means that, well, they're always leading the generation, but they're leading the generation by about 3 or 4 years? Or does it mean that literally because the Wii U failed, they actually just had 2 systems come out in that same generation? Is it that the Wii U and the Switch are in fact the same generation, even though the Wii U itself lasted about 4 years? Is it just an 8-year generation, and in reality the Switch is just the Wii U Pro? Because there is a legitimate reason to think that. When you look at what the Nintendo Switch is versus the gamepad that you'd get with the Wii U with the screen in it, with a lot of the same games crossing over, you could think, well, okay, they had a prototype, or they had the Wii U, and then everything the Wii U did, they then tweaked what does work, and they did it on the Switch, and they took away some things that perhaps weren't as essential, like the dual screen gameplay. So you could see the Switch itself as the Wii U Pro. But obviously that's not how Nintendo view it, and that's probably a little bit food for thought for some people, but not really how anyone looks at the Nintendo Switch. And so now there's rumours, as there have been rumours every year since the Switch released in 2017, that there would be an upgrade, a Switch Pro. Now, let's look at the evidence for what Nintendo have done before. Now, well, hang on, just coming back to the power thing that I was mentioning. Is the Switch going to be able to keep up with the power of the Xbox Series X? No. Is it going to be able to keep up with the power of the PS5? No. However, because of the Xbox Series S, which is not as powerful as the Series X, and that games need to be compatible with both the Series X and the Series S, it may mean that games that end up on the PS5 are held back because they also want it to run on the Xbox Series S, which might mean that there is a slither of hope that games that come out for the PS5 could somehow still be downgradable enough to work comfortably on the Nintendo Switch. but it's not likely. And if Sony, who aren't held down by the Xbox Series S, decide to make a game that looks amazing and does everything capable to get every last drop of power out of the PS5, people would say, well, this is nothing that the Switch could even begin to do. And so it will mean that the Switch starts to seem outdated, which it's been struggling with, but because just like the Wii had motion controls, Switch has an advantage. Switch has an advantage, and that's that it is both a home console and a portable. I use it probably 70 to 80% as a handheld, and then occasionally I'll play on a big screen. And especially if I'm streaming something, then I'll play it on a big screen, but otherwise I use it as a handheld. But it's also their home console. You could view it in a sense that perhaps, well, Nintendo doesn't really do a home console, and they're just giving you home console functionality, but realistically, this is just a handheld. And when you think about it, the PSP and PS Vita had the potential to do games on the big screen by connecting up with cables, but not as obvious, not straight out of the box like you can with the Switch. But then obviously Nintendo themselves released the Switch Lite, which means that the Joy-Cons cannot be taken off. I don't know, because I don't have one, if you can then use external Joy-Cons with the Switch Lite for two-player games, or just if you want to use the Pro Controller with the Switch Lite, you may be able to. But you can't take the Joy-Cons off, and you can't connect it to a television. It makes it so you don't have to buy the dock, and the Joy-Cons don't have to be separate, so it makes it cheaper, and they can sell more Switch Lites to people. So in a sense there, we already have a Switch revision in the Switch Lite. But let's look what Nintendo have done in the past. Let's go all the way back. If we view both the home consoles and the handhelds as something separate to see what they can tell us. Now, the NES, the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, was itself a revision, jigged about things compared to the Famicom from Japan. It wasn't the exact same machine in any way. The controllers weren't tethered. There was no Famicom disk system equivalent to the NES. There was a bunch of differences, and it may have even been that one had got slightly different audio or something. I can't remember. But realistically, that was just because it was their first console, and putting this thing out in Japan and then a couple of years later in the rest of the world, they played around with it, and it was the first time. So there you go. When it came to the Super Nintendo, they did do a revision, and well, in fact, they did a revision of the NES, which people refer to as the NES Junior, I think, and it got it looks a bit like a cheese wedge, and it came with a controller which I believe was shaped like a dog bone. It looks a bit more like the Super Nintendo controller. But basically, other than the fact that it was top-loader, that's what people described it as, other than the fact it was a top-loading NES, it was essentially still an NES. It didn't add anything, didn't upgrade the graphics or anything. It wasn't that it got exclusive games or games that ran better because it was the NES Junior. And the same thing happened with Super Nintendo. In Japan, you may have got the Satellaview, which was an add-on, and we didn't get any CD add-ons, even though they were planned. We didn't get any CD add-ons anywhere around the world, so there was nothing like the Famicom disk system, which came out just in Japan, or just anywhere in particular, which meant anything different for the Super Nintendo. But we did get a revision which made it smaller, and maybe that was called the SNES Junior. I can't remember what really made it too different. I think it was just basically it was a bit smaller. And then with the N64, we did get the N64 disk drive, the N64 DD, which came out just in Japan, but that you could see that as an upgrade, but you still had to have the original system. It wasn't like having a pro version of the N64, and there were exclusive games on it, and it perhaps did give more RAM, but you ended up with more RAM if you bought the RAM pack with Donkey Kong 64 anyway. So, other than there being a Pikachu N64, which had a slightly different shape, there was no N64 revision. I can just say straight away, there was, other than the Panasonic Q, which had a DVD player built in, there was no revision to the GameCube. There was a Wii Mini, which, and along the way they'd already done this, took away the backwards compatibility with GameCube and GameCube controllers and memory cards, It made it smaller, and I don't think the Wii Mini was actually significantly smaller than the original the original Wii, but it certainly wasn't more powerful. Then we get to the Wii U, which, as we've just been discussing, kind of flopped, and so there certainly wasn't a revision, unless you kind of view, as I just said, that perhaps the Switch itself was the revision of the Wii U, but because you couldn't put the Wii discs or the Wii U discs into the Switch in any way, it was just more like a new system, a clean start. And so then we get to the Switch, and now they're saying about there being a Switch Pro, but as we've just gone through all of the previous home consoles of Nintendo, they've never really done an upgrade. So that's where we look at the handhelds, because it's a very different story. On the handheld front, Nintendo released the Game Boy, and eventually they released the Game Boy which had a light in it, and they released the Game Boy Pocket. And I think the Game Boy Pocket is actually the version that got a light on it. But the Game Boy Pocket was smaller. It had a slightly better screen, which meant that you could certainly see it better, but I don't think it ran any faster, and there certainly wasn't any games where you had to say, well, you've got to play them on the Game Boy Pocket for them to work better. But then we got the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Color, I always considered it as the sequel to the Game Boy in its own machine. It was backwards compatible. All of the games that worked on the original Game Boy could plug into the Game Boy Color, and there would be certain games that would plug into the Game Boy Color that wouldn't work on the original Game Boy. And the games on the Game Boy Color that were exclusive to it were in full colour, and then there were some that would work on both. And if they're on the colour, then they would be in colour. If they were on the older Game Boy, the Game Boy Pocket, they would be in black and white. The Game Boy Color could have colour, which was a definite upgrade, a pro upgrade you could say, and I do believe it ran faster. Not significantly, but it ran faster. It was now capable of running something like a version of Donkey Kong Country or a version of Super Mario Brothers from the NES, and it could run them well. And so that was the first time in like the late 1990s where Nintendo released a revision of their previous console, which wasn't 100% a clean slate, and it was more than just backwards compatible. It's like it got upgraded visuals, it could do things the other version couldn't do. And yet you could still play games that came out for the Game Boy Color on the older edition. And then after that, we got the Game Boy Advance. And the Game Boy Advance had a revision. It went from the original one that you'd hold, which would kind of be horizontally orientated, to a Game Boy Advance SP, which would be a clamshell, which I had never even thought about this until recently. When you open up the clamshell, it kind of meant that the Game Boy was kind of vertically orientated, basically the same shape that the original was. And I'd never even considered that until recently. But anyway, that's a different story. So, the Game Boy Advance SP, it had a clamshell, which meant that the screen was more protected when you weren't using it. It would have like a light in it, and you could have it backlit, whereas you couldn't on the original Game Boy Advance, and that was a bit of a nightmare to see and play in certain lighting conditions. The backlight on the SP wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. And then, of course, there was no other upgrades to it. You got the Game Boy Micro, which removed backwards compatibility with the original Game Boy, which the Advance always could do. But there was no other power upgrades about the SP. So after you could view the Game Boy Color as a pro version of the Game Boy, you probably shouldn't see the SP as a pro version of the Game Boy Advance. It was just a redesign with a backlight and a chargeable battery in it and stuff like this. It wasn't, in terms of what you'd actually play, an upgrade at all. Then we got the Nintendo DS, and the Nintendo DS had a revision, which was the DS Lite, which didn't upgrade the power. It just meant that it perhaps got a better screen, was a smaller form factor, and perhaps a better battery. And it was much like the SP was to the Game Boy Advance. But then there was the DSi, and the DSi, you could say, was a pro version of the Nintendo DS. It got a camera, which meant that certain games would require and use this camera. You could take photos with it, which you could just see as like, well, it's a little bell and whistle, but obviously there'd be software built in that would take advantage of this. And you could also get DSiWare. You could download games, and they would be exclusive to the Nintendo DSi. They took away Game Boy Advance backwards compatibility, added in an SD card slot so you could download games, but it had exclusive games. You could absolutely see that the DSi was some sort of Nintendo DS Pro. It didn't improve the games or the running of the games that were already available for the Nintendo DS, and it didn't get games that were significant. Well, you'd get exclusive games that you'd be able to download that were small games, frankly, and it might be games that use the camera, but there weren't games that were more graphically or in terms of what the processor could handle in the worlds of the games weren't more advanced than the previous version of the DS. But because you could get exclusive games and it got extra functionality, you could see the DSi as a Nintendo DS Pro. But again, just like with the Game Boy Color, it's a little bit of a grey area. But this is where we get to where we really hit the nail on the head. The Nintendo 3DS came out, and then later on had the 3DS XL, which was a bigger version, and that's just cosmetic, bigger screen, it might be slightly more comfortable, or this and that, but essentially the same machine. But we got the Nintendo New 3DS, and it's always been a terrible name, and maybe this is what we'll be seeing with the Switch Pro, that it won't be the Switch Pro, it'll be the new Nintendo Switch, or the Nintendo New Switch, probably the new Nintendo Switch, because it was the new Nintendo 3DS. And the new Nintendo 3DS added a second little nub, which worked like the second thumbstick, because they'd already released an add-on for the 3DS, which gave you dual stick abilities in games like Resident Evil Revelations or Metal Gear Solid 3. You could use a second analog stick, which would be attached to the Nintendo 3DS. The new Nintendo 3DS added a little nub, which really didn't work as well, and it was inferior to the add-on you'd add to the original version of the 3DS to use dual sticks. There's no two ways about that, but it was just a lot more convenient. But also, because of the extra power of the new Nintendo 3DS, the 3D capabilities in games worked better. It tracked your eyes, tracked your head movement, and so you'd have a bigger sweet spot for the 3D to work. And that was great. But again, that upgrade doesn't necessarily mean that it's a Pro Edition. But you then got more power under the hood, which meant that firstly, and I think this wasn't quite true, but they said that because of this extra power, we can now emulate SNES games, and you can get Super Nintendo games on the 3DS eShop. I think that was just a hokey reason to say, well, there is something exclusive to the new Nintendo 3DS if you want to play Zelda or Super Mario World or something from the Super Nintendo, Super Street Fighter 2 or whatever. And you'd have to have the new machine to play those old Super Nintendo games. In a sense, that was like the upgrade to the DSi, that you could get some older games, some smaller games, which didn't make the system more powerful, but it was exclusive to this upgrade. But then you got something like Xenoblade Chronicles, which got a port to the 3DS and was exclusive to the new Nintendo 3DS. You couldn't play it on the original 3DS, you had to have the new Nintendo 3DS. And I might be wrong in saying this, but I think it was the only one that did this. The only game that was exclusive to the new Nintendo 3DS. There may have been one or two others, but nothing big or famous. I know it was a fact that there were some games that ran better on the new Nintendo 3DS, and maybe quite a few games. Super Smash Bros. For 3DS, I think, is one of them, and maybe you could get some 3D on certain games on the new Nintendo 3DS that wouldn't be 3D on the original 3DS. But obviously, Nintendo had some trouble with the launch and getting sales of the 3DS for the first time with a handheld, and so they had to really work to get the price down, which eventually they did. Well, they did a big price cut, but eventually they did with the 2DS, which we'll come on to in a second. And they had to just try and make it so that as many people had it as possible. Now, obviously, when the new Nintendo 3DS came out, if 100 million people bought it, they'd probably say, well, let's use the extra processing power and just say, well, this is exclusive to the new Nintendo 3DS. But because they were already struggling a bit with the 3DS overall, they didn't perhaps think to keep putting games exclusively for the new Nintendo 3DS, and perhaps Xenoblade was just their plan for, well, let's just do one, just to give people a reason to say, well, we need to buy the new Nintendo 3DS when it launches. And then, as I mentioned, there was the 2DS, which took away the 3D, but was basically a 3DS, and then the new 2DS, which was as powerful as the new 3DS. I believe still added in the extra thumbstick, and I believe it was still a nub rather than a second actual thumbstick. But it was as powerful as the new 3DS, but it still took away the 3D, which again meant it was more affordable, and this was coming out, I believe, after the time that the Switch came out, so it meant that they could still push it to people that couldn't afford a Switch. So, in the case of the new Nintendo 3DS, we saw an absolute upgrade, a Pro version, with exclusive software, although almost none, and that is going to be telling as well in the answer of, is there going to be a Switch Pro? Because Nintendo have clearly only done very small upgrades and not really supported them. Probably the one that got the most support was the Game Boy Color, but that came out 10 years after the original Game Boy, so for them to be pushing it and putting things into colour first and foremost, which they didn't even do with Pokemon Gold and Silver, and that tells you something, tells you that Nintendo would rather serve the fan base, the install base of a console that they've already got, without alienating people. So if they were to put out a Switch Pro, would current Switch games run on it better? Would Doom Eternal run on it better? Possibly, maybe. Maybe that's up to the developers to make a downloadable patch so that some of these things will happen. And we have seen evidence of that with PS5 and Xbox Series X backwards compatibility, that this is now on developers' minds to make it so that something runs better from a previous generation as a part of the value proposition for a new console. But would Nintendo put out a Switch Pro? The evidence doesn't lean heavily towards it. Would a Switch Pro mean that they could make their current system keep up with the PS5 and the Xbox Series X? Probably not. They're not going to. That would be a new system. If they could do a portable handheld Switch that was as powerful as a PS5, I'd be flabbergasted at the moment. I kind of believe, and people will scoff at this, especially later, that when you look at the size of the PS5 and the size and the built-in fans and everything on the Xbox Series X, and that they're having to put so much into these to get them to work, to get them to not overheat and stuff, there will reach a point where we can't make things as powerful as we're creating without some trade-off in size. The PS5 is ginormous. The Xbox Series X is fairly big itself. It's this big triple stacked GameCube, basically. They can't make things the way they were in the past and make them so they have the power they did. And obviously the Switch, we could look at it and say, well, that's as powerful as a Wii U, which is as powerful as a PS3, and the PS3 itself was as big as a dinosaur. So yeah, in the future there probably will be a Switch-sized PS5. Probably. But there might be some point where they can't do this anymore. So would the Switch Pro be able to be as powerful as an Xbox Series X? Probably not. Certainly not now. Will it be able to be as powerful as a PS5? No. The answer is no. Could it be as powerful as a PS4? Potentially, because we have had Xbox Ones and and PS4s, which have got smaller editions, as well as their Pro editions. Now, obviously, the PS4 was the first time Sony released a Pro edition of its machine. Up to that point, they had released PS2 Slim, PS1, which was the smaller revision, PS3 Slim and PS3 Super Slim, but we got the PS4 Pro, which added extra power. And then we got the Xbox One getting the Xbox One X, which was the most powerful thing of all time when it came out. And the older games would run better, and new games would run better and have extra bells and whistles because they knew it would work for PS4 Pro or Xbox One X. But they still had to work on the older machines. So if Nintendo put out a Pro, surely it will still need to work on the original Switch, just like a lot of Game Boy Color games still would work on the original Game Boy. But whereas that was going from black and white to colour, this isn't going to be something as so eye-catchingly obvious. Something that's eye-catchingly obvious like that probably isn't going to happen again. From monochrome to colour is instantaneous. You can see where the improvement is. When we're talking about faster load times, bigger worlds and stuff like this, is that going to happen where the Switch Pro can do Breath of the Wild 2 better than Breath of the Wild, to the point that Breath of the Wild 2 wouldn't be possible on the original Switch? No, they're going to want to make it so it will certainly still be playable on the original Switch, and they're probably not going to say, well, we've sold 50 million or 80 million Switches and we're going to leave all those people behind just because it will work better on the Switch Pro. And if they didn't have that thought before, look at Cyberpunk 2077. That game worked okay enough on PC and even Stadia. I've got it for Stadia. And it worked fine on the Xbox Series X and the PS5. It doesn't work really well, even though it was made for the PS4 and it was made for the Xbox One. It doesn't work on those systems. So if Nintendo start thinking that they're going to put out Breath of the Wild 2, and it's going to be that we tailor it to work amazing on the Switch Pro, and then it's not going to probably work that well on the original Switch, they're going to get the same negative reaction that CD Projekt Red got for Cyberpunk 2077. It doesn't make sense for them to release a Switch Pro like this. Now, if you look to phones, and I have an iPhone, I'm an iPhone user, I have an iPhone 6, and I play Pokemon Go on it. And it's my old phone, because a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago in fact, I got an iPhone 8, and Pokemon Go runs infinitely better on it. It crashes on the iPhone 6. Now, the iPhone 8 itself is in due need for an upgrade. I wanted to get the iPhone 10 at the time, so there was something better even then. But it still works to this day, and I can still play Pokemon Go, which can be something that drains power. It's not the most intense graphically game out there, but it can still work just absolutely fine on the iPhone 8. It probably works better on the 10, 11, 12, 12 Pro, 12 Pro Max. Whatever the latest iPhone is, it probably runs an absolute dream on there. But when they make mobile games, they have to make them scalable. When they make PC games, depending what PC you've got, they'll make the game scalable. I played Resident Evil 3 on the PC last year, and I could turn the settings up or down. I could turn the settings up to absolute full, and I think the game even gave me warnings. This is going to struggle, but I still could do it. When I tried to stream the game, it crashed almost instantly. So I had to turn it down, and then I could play the game just fine. Now, because games are designed for PCs and have this capability, and because games are designed for iPhones and Android phones, and because there are so many different options out there, developers now make games that are scalable. So could they make it so that the games will be scalable from the Switch to the Switch Pro, and then third-party developers will scale it up even more for the Xbox Series S, and then up even more for the PS5 and Xbox Series X? Maybe. It is so much more possible nowadays than it has ever been before because of PCs, because of mobile devices. But it's not something that we've really had a lot of evidence for previously working with consoles. And also, imagine the kids at school where it's like, oh, they've both got a Switch. I've got the Switch Lite, I've got an original Switch, and I've got the Switch Pro. And we're all going to play the game together except for it's kind of not working on the older machines and is working on this one. They're going to go home upset, tell their parents, there'll be complaints, and that could be a PR disaster, just as CD Projekt Red has had with Cyberpunk. So will there be a Switch Pro? If I'm going to place my bet, I would say that we got the new Nintendo 3DS, we got the DSi, and looking at the Switch as a handheld device, I would say yes, absolutely, there is going to be something, because we got the Switch Lite, which reinvigorated and gave a cheaper option, a new reason for Switch owners, even people that had already got the Switch, which is portable in itself, the reason to buy a second Switch being the Lite one. I think Nintendo still will put out some revision of the Switch. However, I do not think we are going to get the Switch Pro. I do not think it's just going to be that it's named the new Nintendo Switch. And even if it is called the new Nintendo Switch, or if it is called the Switch Pro, what we are going to get is basically just going to be the next Nintendo Switch. Because we're in 2021, and the Switch came out 4 years ago in 2017. Now, they may call it the Switch Pro or the new Nintendo Switch, and it will be backwards compatible, just as the iPhone games from iPhone 6 to 8 to 10 to 12 all are backwards compatible with each other, and they just scale how well they work. And just as you can play a game on an old PC or a new PC or a gaming PC, and they're still scalable, and they were scalable between the PS4 to the PS4 Pro to the PS5, getting better and better performance out of them, I think the next Switch will be announced, and they'll just say, hey, it's a continuation of the Switch, but in reality, it is just the next Switch. Just as Nintendo said that the DS was a third pillar to sit alongside the GameCube and to sit alongside the Game Boy Advance, they're going to take that same cautious approach and say, here's the next Switch. And all the games that work on the previous Switch are going to work on it, and all the games that come out on this are still going to work for the Nintendo Switch until they don't. And when I say until they don't, maybe they'll say something silly like Microsoft said with the Xbox Series X, which is, yeah, Halo will still work on the Xbox One, and people are like, oh, isn't that going to hold down Halo 5? And then they delayed it. Nintendo could say something silly where it's going to be like, yeah, all the games that come out for the Switch Pro, the new Nintendo Switch Pro, whatever they want to call it, are going to work on the old machines. And then later on they'll just be like, well, we've reached the point where enough of our user base just use the new one that we're going to unleash the full power of the Switch Pro. Now, so many of the games that come out will still work, and some of them will put a label on the box, say, for best performance, have the new Nintendo Switch Pro, or the next Switch, or whatever, and that's what they'll do. Whatever the next machine is that Nintendo put out is still going to be called Switch, and it will probably be called New Nintendo Switch, as the evidence, New Super Mario Brothers, or whatever. And because I even think there's new Pokemon Snap. Like, Nintendo love the new name on things. But anyway, I think that's what Nintendo will do. But realistically, it's not going to be a halfway thing. It's going to be, they're going to view it as this is the next 5 years. It's not going to be that, right, we're going to do this like the the PS4 Pro or the Xbox One Series X, where 2 years later we're going to be lining up the next proper machine. It's going to be that this is the next machine, and they're just going to spin it out for as long as they can until they suddenly say, okay, we've got to put out something entirely new. And just because of the mistakes Nintendo made by naming the Wii U with a confusing name, New Nintendo Switch, to me that's always been a bit of a dumb name. Switch Pro, people might understand it, but I don't even know if they will understand that they need that. So I think they would, if they're going to be smart, they will go with something like Switch 2 or Super Switch or Ultra Switch. They're going to do something where you know this is an upgrade. This is something better than what you used to be able to get. But anyway, they're my thoughts. Let me know what your thoughts are wherever you're seeing this. If you're watching the video version on youtube.com/extreme improv, put some comments into the comment section. I check them every so often and I'll respond to stuff. If you are listening on Podbean, not Podbean, I don't think we're on Podbean anymore. If you're listening on a podcast app such as Spotify or Spreaker, where this is definitely at, or Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts, wherever you're listening, if you're listening on your Alexa device, it's all good. Feel free to give some comments wherever you can. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, especially if you want to support these shows with definitely there being lots more in the future. Head over to youtube.com/extreme improv, smash that subscribe button, and facebook.com/extreme improv, and give us a like on the page. And that will just help more people to be able to discover it, because as these websites work on social media, the more likes we got, the more followers and subscribers we've got, the more the platforms will push them out to new users. And then we'll be able to give lots more thoughts like this. We're going to have more shows coming up with special guests, like I've been saying across these shows. We also have the Mega Movie podcast, the Superkick Mania Pro Wrestling podcast, lots of podcasts based around improv. We do weekly streaming improv comedy shows, which often lean into video games, movies and other pop culture, and they're called Extreme Improv Extremed, so do check them out, because they're on multiple times a week. Our website is extremeimprov.co.uk, and we've got something special coming up soon. So for me, for now, my name is David Pustansky. You can follow me at David Pustansky on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And until next time, have a good one, stay safe, always be gaming, and always stay extreme.